Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fifth webinar in the ALMA 2020 webinar series. My name is Thad Gurley, and I will be moderating today's discussion on leadership and laboratory safety, the manager's role. We like for our webinars to be interactive, so we urge you to submit your questions at any time during the webinar. Our speaker will address the questions at the conclusion of the webinar. Please use the question box on your GoToWebinar browser to submit questions. We will try to answer as many questions as possible, but if we run out of time during the question answer session, I will forward any unanswered questions to the presenter. Additional resources for the webinar are located on the right side of your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the ALMA website shortly following the webinar. I would especially like to thank our sponsors, BMOS Lab Seating and Particle Testing Authority, for sponsoring our fifth webinar. Without their sponsorship, we would be unable to provide the webinars to our ALMA community free of charge. So with that, I would like to introduce our speaker today, Dr. James Kaufman. Dr. James Kaufman is founder and president emeritus of the Laboratory Safety Institute. He received his bachelor's degree in chemistry from Tufts University and his doctorate in organic chemistry from Worcester Polytechnic Institute. After 2 years as a postdoctoral fellow at WPI Chemical Engineering Department, Dr. Kaufman joined the Dow Chemical Company. At Dow, he became increasingly involved in laboratory safety. He authored laboratory safety guidelines. Originally distributed by Dow, now over 6 million copies in 21 languages of the widely requested and reprinted brochure are in circulation. The Laboratory Safety Institute is an international nonprofit center for safety and science education. LSI's lectures and courses, AV lending library, many grants, internet discussion lists, and publications help both academic and non-academic institutions in 30 countries and 135 types of labs throughout the world. Over 100,000 scientists and science educators have attended these courses and presentations. Dr. Kaufman is a former member of the American Chemical Society's Council Committee on Chemical Safety and is past chairman of the ACS Division of Chemical Health and Safety. He is the author and narrator of numerous courses, videos, and seminars in the laboratory safety field. Most recently, he recorded online distance learning courses for those who are remotely interested in lab safety. Dr. Kaufman, thank you for joining us today.
Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you all for being here, joining for this conversation today about leadership and safety, the manager's role. As you said, my name's Jim Kaufman, and I'm with the Laboratory Safety Institute in Natick, Massachusetts. Our motto is teach, learn, and practice science safely. Today, most of the things that we do are virtual, like this presentation. I just completed a virtual lab inspection for a college last week and a petroleum refinery the week before. One of the reasons we're here is because there is an issue which I like to call the cycle of ignorance. I realized this in the 70s when I started working for Dow, because I learned more about lab safety in one day at Dow than I had in 25 years in school. The cycle starts with we don't teach safety in school. So the students don't learn it. They don't develop a safety ethic. They graduate without safety knowledge and safety ethics, and then they become the teachers, and the cycle is completed. Imagine that you're on this nice beach. When I talk to managers, when I talk to senior management at organizations, they tell me they have a real need for greater support from the upper management and upper administration. Imagine you're walking down this beach and you stubbed your toe and you bent over and you found you had a lantern. And you rub the lantern, and of course you know what happens. A genie comes out and says you could have 3 wishes. And what I've found is that the 3 wishes that people normally ask are, I wish our president and direct reports cared more about lab safety. I wish our president and his or her direct reports were more actively involved. And number three, I wish they would appropriate more funds so we could address more issues for health and safety. We put together this leadership and safety seminar. These are some of the industries that have hosted it, and these are some of the academic institutions that have hosted it. And it's always with the goal of improving the lab safety program. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. How do we improve a lab safety program? Whether you happen to have started from scratch or you have a highly developed program, the goal is to go from good to better to best and not be satisfied there. Let's make it outstanding. What do we mean by a lab safety program? Well, a planned group of activities, functions, and practices which are going to help address your health and safety needs. Let's see how you're doing. I'd like you to make a note and see which one of these 5 levels adequately describes the program at your place. You get 0 points if you have no program and people treat it with disdain. Many organizations have some folks in there. I like to call them Dr. Wilson. He or she has been there for a long time who says, I don't need this, leave me alone, get out of my lab. I don't have any time for this, this is not important. That's a 0 for Wilson. And if that's the program gets a 0. If you only react to accidents and then run around trying to find somebody to blame and then go back to work and business as usual, at least you reacted to the accident. That's 1 point. 2 points for following rules, policies, and regulations. The bad news is if you don't have rules and policies and regulations, then if they're not in writing, you don't have them. And if you don't enforce them, we call that lip service. 3 points if you have a management system such as hazard analysis, pre-startup review. 4 points if you're measuring leading and lagging indicators. Are you familiar with the difference between a leading and a lagging indicator? The number of coffins that you bought last year for colleagues and eulogies you provided at burial ceremonies, that's a lagging indicator, and so is counting how many lost time accidents we had. A leading indicator is the number of times as a manager you spoke to the people who report to you and told them that this is really important. That would be a leading indicator. If the manager were to give a new employee who reported to her or him part of the new employee safety orientation on day 1, as my boss at Dow did, that would be a leading indicator. And finally, it becomes a core value for the organization. The American Chemical Society said it's a core value a few years ago, put it into their strategic plan. Is it in your organization's strategic plan as a core value? That's something that senior management needs to do. At ACS, you can't get a national award now without taking into account your safety performance, and you can't publish in their journals without it. If you are in a work environment where people publish articles or have theses that they defend, do you require safety to be part of those? So we want to create a more effective lab safety program, and we're going to do it by improving the leadership function. What are some of the elements in a good lab safety program? Well, I've got a checklist that has 33 items on it. That's the first page. Here's the second page. And I'll be happy to send you a copy of this if you'd like to request it. I'm jim@labsafety.org. That's easy. And you can use this to evaluate your program. Put a check mark in the column and see how many check marks you have in each of the columns. If you'd like to be quantitative, give yourself 3 points for everything that's okay. And since they're 33, that's 99 points. I'll give you a bonus point for having the courage to do it quantitatively. 0 to 3 if it needs work, and 0 if it doesn't exist. And if you'd like a little coaching on this, I'll be happy to work with you to help you understand how to use this and all of the elements in it. 4 of the elements that I think are the most important ones are these: the new employee orientation. That's what my boss did. He gave me the safety manual on day 1. He told me if there's anything I want to do that's not in the manual, don't do it, take it to the safety committee. And then he invited me to sign the rules agreement when I came back the next day after I'd read the manual that night. I've read it, I understood it, I agree to follow it. And you'll see that there's a 4th element. I call it the realize. I realize that if I don't follow the rules, it could cost me the privilege of being here. And we'll talk about that when we get to the 6 leadership principles. We have 3 goals. We want people to learn to care about health and safety. We want them to learn how to recognize hazards and how to protect yourself. And that brings me to an interesting visit I had in the Middle East, where I was looking at some flammables cabinets that had self-closing doors. And I noticed that on the side of the cabinet, there was this piece of metal hanging there. And I said to the group I was with, what is that? And they told me. I'm wondering how many of you recognize it and know what it is. And then I said to them, what's its second purpose? And they said, what do you mean? And I said, oh, this is a language to myself. This is a language issue. I'll say it differently. I said, well, what else does it do? And they said, what do you mean? And then I realized it wasn't language, it was knowledge. So I explained it. And then I came back to the United States, and I went to Ohio Wesleyan, and I went to Cornell University, and I went to Green River Community College, and I went to MIT, and I asked 100 people, what is this, and what is its second purpose? And only 50% knew that it's used to hold the door open. There's a little post here, and this goes over the post. And nobody, 0, knew that it is a fusible link that melts at 165 degrees that allows these doors to close automatically if there's a fire in the room and the doors are being held open. But in this laboratory, it broke. And so on the next cabinet, they had machined one out of aluminum, which melts at 650 degrees, and they had defeated the purpose of the device. The laboratories I visit throughout the United States and the rest of the world, many have self-closing cabinets, and I would have to say most. These are broken, missing, sitting on top in a plastic bag, and nobody knows what they are or why they are there. There's a lot of learning to do because we don't know what we don't know. The third goal is to create a safer, healthier learning environment, and this is where the manager plays a critical role because, as we like to say, the dog sled can't go any faster than the lead dog. There are 3 C's to safety, 3 words that begin with the letter C, and the first one is choices. Life is full of choices. Lucy says this to Linus because he's got a snowball there, and she says life is full of choices, and she explains them. You can choose to throw it at me, or you can choose not to throw it at me. And up at the top, it says the only persons free to choose are those who know the choices. Here's an example of choices. Here are 6 eye protection devices, and one of them, which is a goggle, is the worst goggle that you could pick to protect yourself from a chemical or biological splash or droplet. And people are very confused about this because at the last 2 places I audited, I found them using this one and not understanding that it was inappropriate. Why are people confused? Here's an American Chemical Society ad for a $2,500 video, and it says one of these chemists understands lab safety, and on the back it says, and one of them doesn't. Can you tell the difference? Well, I looked at it and I realized that neither one of them knew, nor did the advertising department, so I called them and they changed it to look like this. Now, it's not that wearing blue, I like blue, is better than wearing white. It's not safer. They changed the goggle. Here's the goggle. It's the one that has all the holes in the side and it's directly ventilated. It's inappropriate for chemical splash or chemical droplet. And a directly vented cover goggle is for impact. So life is full of choices, and choices have consequences. That's the second C word. Lucy explains the consequences. Now, if you choose to throw it at me, I'll pound you right into the ground. And if you don't, your head will be spared. And Linus throws down the snowball and says, life is full of choices, but you never get any. And the bottom line is the person's best prepared to choose will know the likely outcomes. We've modified this cartoon to update it to 2020, and we took away his snowball and we put a coronavirus mask, a face mask in his hand, and then the whole language plays through. And if you don't put your mask on, I'll pound you into the ground, and if you do, your head will be spared. And the last cartoon has his mask on. Here's another example of consequences, a rotary evaporator. When I started working at Dow, all the rotary evaporators were protected. They were wrapped in a crisscross pattern, and you can also use that mesh to cover it. I had a phone call a few years ago from somebody from OSHA in Maryland, and he said, Jim, what do you think about this? A young man, 25 years old, is using a rotary evaporator. It's made out of glass, it's evacuated, and it can implode like much of the equipment in our labs today. Suction filtration flasks, bell jars, vacuum desiccators, vacuum distillations, all of Duar flasks for liquid nitrogen. They can all implode. A lab technician was killed when a Duar flask imploded. Well, that wasn't the problem here. The problem here was that the young man who worked for the Thiokol company in Elkton, Maryland, had a reactive material here in the flask that was rotating, and he knew that, so he put a shield in front of it. When he went to take the shield away, take the flask off, he pushed the shield out of the way, and at that instant, as he reached in, the contents of the flask exploded, and the glass fragments slit his throat and killed him. He left behind an 8-month-old child and a spouse. And John Rekas said, Jim, what do you think? And I said, I think he wasn't wearing a face shield. And you know what? It wasn't the money, because the face shield was in the room no farther from him than your monitor is from you. It was a choice, bad choice. It had horrible consequences. And the third C word is, what does it take to convince people to care? And I strongly believe it takes management doing its role properly to make this work. So let's talk about the leadership issue. And I want to begin by asking you three critical questions. Number one, what motivates people to pay attention to safety? If you were going to jot down 2, 3, 4 things that you thought might motivate people, it might include fear, it might include rewards, it might include penalties, discipline functions, jail. It might include social consciousness. It might include caring. There are lots of different things that motivate people to care. A manager who emphasizes this in a new employee safety orientation really can make a strong impression on that new person. How many of you, when you started working, whether it was last year or 25 years ago, had your immediate supervisor sit down with you on the first day and talk about the importance of your health and safety and following the rules? Now, you know what else? You don't have to wait for the new employee orientation to start motivating the people that are going to work with you. How many of you interview candidates who'd like a job at your place? How many of you have ever asked the candidate the lab safety question? I asked those two questions of 50 chemistry department chairs at a meeting of the institutions in the Southeast United States. And everybody put their hand up when I said, do you interview? And when I said, do you ask the lab safety question? They looked at each other, they looked at me and said, what's the question? And the question is, what have you done in the past that's going to allow you to contribute effectively to our department's lab safety program? And you know how many had asked that question? 0, not 1. It would be interesting to know how many of you have ever asked a job candidate that question. Because after today, if we hire people who don't give what I affectionately refer to as a rat's rear, you see my little mascot here? Yep. This is LSI's lab safety rat. This is something that I give to the president of an organization when we do this 4-hour seminar, because it says, we don't give a rat's rear for safety, we give the whole rat. Congratulations, you've just been ratted on for working safely. Now it's your turn to rat on someone else. And this is just a small reward that you could give someone to say thank you for doing a good job. We need a balance of carrots and sticks, rewards and discipline. The second question is, how will the people who work with you know that health and safety in the environment is important? Well, it's going to be the example you set. It's going to be whether you care enough about the rules and policies to help make sure they're enforced. That is a supervisor's responsibility. And finally, if you were to look back at your calendar for the last 30, 60, 90 days, what have you done that visibly demonstrates your commitment to safety? How will the people who report to you know? And what, if you look back, do you see that's been done? There are 6 principles of safety leadership, and these come from a book by James Thomen, Thomen, who worked for 30 years for DuPont. Very interesting book, and this is where I captured these 6 principles. Number 1, management is responsible for the prevention of accidents, injuries, and damage to health and the environment. This is a management responsibility. Who should tell Jim that he's doing a great job and we want to give you a raise, a bonus, and a promotion? Well, that would be my supervisor, my manager. And who is it who should be telling Jim, you're not punctual, the quality of your work isn't good enough, you need to follow the safety rules? That should be my supervisor. This is the management food chain in the organization, and it lies directly with the management. Second principle, all accidents can be prevented. It doesn't mean they necessarily will be, but we have to believe that it's possible to prevent them. Dilbert has a kind of unique look at all of this. Dilbert wrote, our goal this year is 0 disabling injuries. Last year, the goal was 26. In retrospect, it was a mistake because we had to injure 9 employees to meet the goal. So we don't want to pick 6 people and say, well, it seems like we're injuring 6 people every year. Let's designate in advance the 6 of you that are going to be hurt here. No, we want our goal to be 0. Training is essential. We need to provide lots of opportunities for people to learn about which kinds of eye protection are appropriate for what we're doing in a laboratory. Is it safety glasses with side shields? Is that sufficient? Do we need to have an indirectly vented cover goggle? Do our safety glasses come in two types? The regular type and the OTG, the over the glasses type, for people like myself and others among you who are wearing prescription glasses. If you're going to put your safety glasses on over, you need to understand that difference. Okay. And what about face shields? You probably have some face shields. What does it say in your chemical hygiene plan about the use of face shields? Does it say wear glasses, goggles, or face shields? Well, that's not correct. It should say wear glasses, goggles, and for severe exposure, add a face shield. A face shield is not an or. A face shield is always for severe exposure in addition to either glasses or goggles. Let me give you an example. Let's talk for a couple of minutes about electrical safety. And I don't want you to be shocked. So let's take a look at something that you're familiar with, an electrical receptacle. And it's a grounded electrical receptacle. And the first question that comes up is this the proper orientation for an electrical receptacle, or should it be the other way around so it looks like a little smiley face with 2 eyes and a nose or a mouth underneath, with the ground up as it's shown here, or 180 degrees the other way with the ground down? And is there one that's better than the other? I haven't been able to find anything in the electrical code that suggests that one is better than the other, but I can tell you about some of the people I've met who have scars on the backs of their neck because they had a metal chain around their neck hanging down, and something at the end of the chain, and when they leaned over, the plug was not all the way into the receptacle, and the chain draped across the hot and the neutral and shorted out their circuit and turned their chain into a toaster wire, and they had to rip that thing off to stop it from burning. I also have a picture that was sent to me by a father whose child decided to drop a quarter in that little opening, and it sat across the hot and the neutral and destroyed the child's night lamp and burned out the circuit, blew it out. So if you have the ground on top, you avoid some of these possibilities, or you make them a whole lot less likely. The second question that comes up looking at a receptacle is whether the hot and the neutral and the ground are in the right place. And so one quiz question for everybody would be, well, I think we all know that the ground is the roundish one, but what about the others? Which one's the hot and which one's the neutral? Turns out that the wider one, that's the neutral, and the narrower one is the hot. So how do we tell? You need a tester to do that. And here are a couple of different kinds of testers. The one on the left has 3 lights. They both have 3 lights, 2 yellows and a red, and there are directions clearly on there. And the correct is to have the 2 yellows lit up and the red out if everything's okay. Well, when I test receptacles, I find about 1 to 5% of them in that range are either miswired or the ground has become detached or was never there, and that there are problems with them. And these should be checked annually. And the one on the right, that one has a little button on it, and that's good for testing ground fault interrupters, because you can plug this into a receptacle, and if that receptacle happens to be connected to a strip of receptacles, or it has no ground fault interrupter visible, maybe it's in the circuit panel, when you hit that button, it's going to trip the ground fault interrupter. And of course, we know we need to have these receptacles, ground fault interrupter protection, anywhere when you're within about 6 feet of water. So near your sinks, perhaps near your safety shower. And the one that goes often unnoticed would be when somebody has a fish tank and it's plugged into a wall somewhere and there's no sink around, but you could be standing there sloshing away with the water, splashing it on the floor, standing in it, and you've got all this electrical equipment in the fish tank. Easy fix, you can get a portable GFCI to take care of that. Well, here's a gentleman that I hope some of you recognize. Yes, that's Groucho Marx. He had a TV game show called You Bet Your Life. Now, if you have an appliance that has a 2-prong unpolarized plug, that means both of the prongs are the same size. And we were doing our audits recently. We found several pieces of equipment that have 2-prong unpolarized plugs on them. And this gives you the original Regis Philbin 50/50. You can plug it in this way, or you can rotate it 180 and plug it in that way. And when you do that, the case of the appliance, if you've plugged it in backwards, can be 120 volts hot while it's off. About 35 people a year die in the United States because they have unpolarized plugs plugged in backwards, and they touch the appliance with one wet hand and they touch a ground with the other wet hand, and it only takes about 23 milliamperes of current for 25 seconds to put your heart into ventricular fibrillation and kill you. So it's a really good idea wherever there's water to have ground fault interrupters, and it's a good idea to know how to plug in a two-prong unpolarized plug correctly. If you will look at the cable on the appliance, you'll see that one side has ripples or ridges on it, and the other side is smooth. And the convention is the ripple side of the cord goes to the wider side of the outlet. The ripple side of the cord goes to the wider side of the outlet. I would say 99% of the 100,000 people that I've met never learned that this is the correct way to plug in a two-prong unpolarized plug. There are 4 simple questions, and they need to be asked before you go ahead. Number 1, what are the hazards? There are 9 hazards in life: chemical, physical, biological, mechanical, noise, radiation, high-low pressure, electrical stress. These are life's 9 hazards. Can we recognize them? What's the worst thing that could happen? What do we need to do to be prepared? And what are the prudent practices, protective facilities, and protective equipment needed to minimize the risk? Principle number 5 is that all hazards can be safeguarded. This brings us to the issue of emergency planning and response. My favorite cartoon shows the king in the castle and the barbarians rolling in that wooden staircase, and he says, "Get the castle emergency manual." Well, that manual is available, and they say, what does it say? It says, in case of stairs, use fire. And you know today that we don't do that. Today, in case of fire, we use stairs. Okay, so it's not that funny. Think about the types of emergencies. If we were together and we had more time, I'd ask you to make a list of the emergencies. And you might say, okay, we can have spills, we can have fires, we can have cuts, burns. I've got a list of 21 that I'll show you. Suppose you're on fire and you're in a room with a lot of people, other people, and it's only your clothing is on fire. What's the first thing that you should do? That's right, stop, drop, and roll. But what's the second thing you should do after stop, drop, and roll? Which one would you pick? Turns out that you've already done your screaming. The people in the room liked you, so they called 911. It's a bad idea to get a fire blanket because it's going to keep the heat in or make a chimney and bring the gases up into your face. And taking off your clothes after the fire's out is a bad idea because the clothes may have melted to your skin. The answer is to take a shower. Anybody recognize this fella? Yep, that's Kenny Rogers. And in his song, The Gambler, he says, you got to know when to hold 'em, you got to know when to fold 'em, you got to know when to walk away, and you got to know when to run. So if you have a spill, number 3 on my list here, then you better be able to answer the Kenny Rogers question. And in safety manuals and chemical hygiene plans where it says, clean it up immediately, clean up all spills immediately, bad idea. Doesn't take into account the hazard of the material. And if it's less than a gallon, clean it up. If it's more, let it go. Again, a bad choice because What you want to say is, if you can clean it up without hurting yourself or anybody else, and it's not an emergency and not likely to become an emergency, okay. Otherwise, let HAZWOPER trained people clean it up. If you don't take the time in your staff meetings annually to talk your way through all of these, we have a name for that. It's called a recipe for disaster. And there's Grandma out on the floor cold because whatever she was cooking up, it worked. It destroyed the kitchen. There are 3 steps to being prepared. Talk. Give a blank sheet of paper to your colleagues. Ask them to make a list of as many types of emergencies as they can. Gather all the lists, rank order them, and come back and take off the conference all-stars and give one to each person in your department and say, okay, every month from now on, one of you is going to talk about what we're supposed to do when this emergency happens. And then get that procedure in writing, make a poster out of it, and pin it up on your lab safety board as the emergency procedure of the month. Get all the members of your department involved in safety. That's a good manager's role. Get others involved. And finally, you never get good at anything unless you practice. Principle number 5, safety is good business. This was something that William Jefferson at DuPont said, and when Paul O'Neill became the chair of the head of Alcoa, he said, we're going to have the best safety program and the lowest accident frequency rate, because they were in big trouble at that point. Someone said, what about return on shareholder investment? And he said, no, we'll just have the best safety program. 4 years later, their stock price was up, morale was up. The only thing that was down was their accident frequency rate. And someone said, Mr. O'Neill, did you know this when you said this 4 years ago? He said, yes. We pay people to work 40 hours a week, but they have discretionary energy. And they have to decide how hard they want to work. And people who know that you care about them work harder. And finally, the one that I mentioned earlier, working safely is a condition of employment. If you want to play on our team, you play by the rules, and you need to have a clear, disciplined procedure for people who don't want to follow the rules, and it's the manager's job to enforce it. Safety program planning. Have we forgotten anything? Well, sure, having a meteorite come through the roof and take out the conference table. I used to think this was a pretty geeky safety joke until, number one, I learned that there are 15,000 things coming at us that could dinosaur us, make us have another ice age if it were to hit the Earth. And then one hit in Russia, and so maybe it's not such a far-fetched idea. Safety programs, yes, that's what we said. The list, happy to give you a copy of it. And then we need to do a needs assessment. And here's a fun cartoon that I'm happy to send to you with an answer sheet if you'd like it. I'd like you to have a contest. As the head of your department, I'd like you to challenge your colleagues to see who can find the most things wrong with this picture. Maybe you want to offer dinner for 2 at McDonald's or some other exceedingly nice place where you can eat outside. There's a book available for free from the American Chemical Society called the Safety Audit Inspection Manual, about 40 pages of doing lab inspections. We're doing ours virtually now. Works very well. Takes a lot of things to have an effective safety program. Number one, it takes caring about your own health and safety and the health and safety of the people around you. I think that's why my boss at Dow, Don Dix, spent the whole first day doing nothing but talking about safety, because he wanted me to learn to care more. I hope that you will take a role. We won't stop human resources. We won't stop the safety department, whatever they do, but get the immediate supervisor involved in this and make the supervisor's supervisor have to find the person within 1 week and reinforce that message. Safety has to be integral. It can't be something extra. It's got to be just part of doing the job right. At Dow, they said, we pay you to do 3 things here: work safely, do your research, write your reports and patent disclosures. It was integral. And it was on the job performance review form. Number 3, we need rewards. The simplest reward you can give is to say thank you. And if you want, you can have a rat too. But we also need discipline. And so we have to have a discipline procedure in place. Everybody gets careless. Everybody gets forgetful. And I'm grateful that ALMA is giving us an opportunity to review some of these things today. We need lots of refresher training. And finally, participation. There's no magic to this, to getting employees and management involved in safety, students and faculty involved. Everybody can contribute, but you've got to use the 4 magic words. I need your help. Get your colleagues, get your employees and students, faculty involved. You can make an incredible difference in your own health and safety and the health and safety of the people around you by the time and energy that you put into this, and that's the good news. The bad news is you're never going to be done, but it's worth it because no lesson is so important and no task so urgent that we can't take time to make health and safety and the environment integral and important parts of education, work, and life. So I want to say thank you to all of you for joining me, and I'm going to turn it back over to our moderator. I'm looking forward to hearing what questions you have, and I have a seed question to plant with you. We'll see if anybody wants to type in the answer for this. Since we're approaching the holiday season, why is it important at this time of year to find an old car, remove its chrome hubcaps, and use them on which to serve your Eggs Benedict? Thank you.
Dr. Kaufman, thank you for that wonderful presentation on leadership and laboratory safety, the manager's role. So we have time for 2 to 3 questions, and I'll keep my eye on the chat board and the questions board about answering your question. Okay. So the first question is you mentioned about new employee orientation. What about instituting a safety conscious environment in an existing lab?
You have an existing lab and you have all the folks that are working there, and if you don't have currently the supervisor providing this, then I would suggest that the supervisor give out a blank sheet of paper to all of the folks working in the lab and ask them to write down the 10 most important things that a new person should know about lab safety coming to work in that group, and take all of those and rank order them, build your David Letterman top however many, and come back and give one to each member of the department and say, okay, next time we meet, I'd like you to talk for 2 or 3 minutes on what's the important content here. So in that existing department, now you have everybody contributing. The supervisor doesn't tell them what's important. They get to tell the supervisor, and they get to train the supervisor. The supervisor doesn't train them. The manager doesn't train them. They train the manager. and everybody participates in it. This is very important. Everybody participates.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for that. So do you have any recommendation for a lab manager in a department that needs to work with diplomacy among different research groups? How to get all of them involved?
Diplomacy, interesting. I was reading something recently about tact and thinking about, how you choose the words that you choose and the kind of difference that it makes. Think about this. If you were to say to somebody, when I look at you, time stands still. That's pretty nice, kind of a compliment. Well, here's the same thought. You've got a face that would stop a clock. Now, which one of these do you think is going to get the most favorable kind of feedback from whoever you're speaking to? Thinking about the words before they come out really helps, because it's hard to push them back in when you're having a conversation. And listening a lot and thinking before responding, that can help. A lot of the time when LSI is invited to come in to an organization, it's not as a safety consultant, it's as a marriage counselor, because environmental health and safety and the other folks are now at loggerheads over getting along. And I find that if you're too authoritarian, that this doesn't play well in a lot of places.
Got it. Great. Thank you. And so, yeah, I've got several questions about, your virtual safety inspections. So could you comment a bit more on those, and how do you perform them in practice without missing details? So several questions about your virtual lab inspections.
Okay. Even when we're there live, we make no guarantee that we're going to identify all the unsafe conditions and unsafe practices. And we're there really to help identify things that may have been overlooked or taken for granted, seeing things that people don't ordinarily see. We have folks in the lab going around with a camera, often on a cell phone, and using that, or a tablet, and talking and looking, and I'm helping them direct to places where I know it would be good to look to try to see what's going on. That's the process that we follow, and we have an orientation session before, when we prepare to make sure we're ready to do this and everybody understands their roles and how this is going to work.
Okay, great. I think we have time for one more question. And so there are a lot of nuanced areas of safety in the lab that most people miss, such as the door clips on the acid cabinets. Are there any resources for supervisors and managers to learn about these often overlooked safety risks?
There are a variety of checklists that are available, and I have one called "Is Your Lab a Safe Place to Work?", which I'm happy to share, and I have another one entitled, which we call the OSHA inspection checklist, because it has references to the OSHA standards that would be violated if you were to say, we're not doing this and you ought to be. If it relates to something that you're doing and you're not doing it, they give you the chapter and verse from the general industry standard. So we have two that we can share if people would like to request them.
Well, that's great. Yeah, I think they can. They have your email address, and I think if people, they can reach out to you and and maybe ask for those resources. So great. So
right, and if anybody would like a PDF of the slide deck, I'm happy to share the PDF of the slide deck.
Well, great. Well, thanks again, Dr. Kaufman. So this brings us to the end of our 5th webinar in the 2020 ALMA webinar series. We would like to remind you that this webinar will be available on the ALMA website. On behalf of ALMA, we would like to thank Dr. James Kaufman for presenting today. We would also like to thank the audience for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us today. Thanks again to BMOS Lab Seating and Particle Testing Authority for sponsoring this webinar. For more information on our upcoming webinars, please visit the ALMA website. We look forward to you joining our next webinar on November the 18th when Joe Carey presents on Laboratory Directors, Find Balance in the Pandemic. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.